Hello and welcome. My name is Julia Halevi. For those of you who don't know, I'm the acting president of the BAC, the Boston Architectural College. And for those of you who don't know much about the college, we've been around since 1889, and we now offer programs at the master's and bachelor's level in architecture, landscape architecture, interior design, and design studies, all of which are accredited by a series of different professional groups. This winter's been pretty challenging for all of us weather-wise, but we've had a wonderful winter inside this building. We have been recognized nationally in 3 different levels. Our practice department received an award from the Council of Higher Education Accreditation for its assessment, and we are the first school in all of New England to get this prize, so that's pretty good for the small BAC. We were also recognized in that we were awarded the category of, and it's a volunteer category that you have to apply for it, by the Carnegie Foundation as community engaged, which is an important step for us. And finally, we were named an experimental site by the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, so that we can offer education that is both community-based and competencies-based and in classrooms, and count all of that toward degree. So it's a really important step forward for us. The Boston Architectural College brings energy to innovative conversations about design and the city. Tonight, through this lecture on the humanities, we are here to celebrate the life and work of Dean Arcangelo Cassieri, who served the BAC for over 50 years from 1943 to 1995. Dean Cassieri challenged us to raise questions about the role that design plays in society. Bernie Goba, Don Brown, Russ Feldman, and Anthony Pina have all been instrumental in keeping this lectureship alive. Thanks, Bernie. He's here tonight. We want to express our thanks for their energy and commitment. Each year, the BAC invites a distinguished speaker to present a public lecture on the many ways in which architecture and design interact with other disciplines and enrich our common life. This year's 23rd Cassieri Lecture in the Humanities is Anupama Kundu. And you will see as she speaks that her values are very near and dear to our own. It's a wonderful opportunity we have. Anupama Kundu is an accomplished architect and educator. Her architecture practice started in 1990. Her work focuses on material research and experimentation towards an architecture that has low environmental impact and that is appropriate for its socioeconomic context. Anupama has built extensively in India and has worked, researched, and taught in a range of cultural contexts, including TU Berlin, the AA in London, Parsons New School of Design in New York, and the University of Queensland in Brisbane. She is currently professor at UCJC Madrid, where she is the chair of Affordable Habitat. She is also the Strauss visiting critic at Cornell University. Anupama's work extends to urban design and planning projects. She is the author of Roger Anger, Research on Beauty, Recherche sur la Beauté, Architecture 1958 through 2008, published in 2009. Her latest publication is a chapter entitled Rethinking Affordability in Economic and Environmental Terms in the book Inclusive Urbanization, Rethinking Policy, Practice, and Research in the Age of Climate Change, 2015. Anupama was born in Pune, India. She graduated from Sir J.J. College of Architecture, University of Mumbai in 1989, and received her PhD degree from the TU Berlin in 2008. In 2013, Kundu received her honorable mention in the ArcVision International Prize for Women in Architecture for her dedication when approaching the problem of affordability of construction and sustainability in all aspects. Before I welcome Anupama to the podium, I just want to remind you that don't go home right away. We have a wonderful reception going on downstairs. And now I'd like you to give your full attention and warm welcome to Anupama Kundu for the Cassieri Lecture entitled Building Knowledge.
Really happy to be here. Thanks a lot for inviting me. And before I begin, I would like to remember my uncle, my cousins here, my father's sister lived here in Boston, lives here in Boston, and her husband, who really very, very recently passed away, used to teach here 20 years ago. And that's how I knew this institute. And the invitation came so close to his passing. And my cousin is here with me, so you don't know that you have facilitated my visit here, and that has also a personal meaning for me. On the other hand, I also will remember this place, in the future, because I was asked to write a small note on Fry Otto, who passed away a few days ago and was awarded the Pritzker. And sitting here in this library, and I had other plans, but I landed up, writing a little piece on him, or writing a few thoughts about him. And while doing so, I realized that he was probably the first pioneer of those values that you also stand for, pioneer of collaborative practice, pioneer of architecture, looking at architecture as not its outer form, but trying to, build ecologically. He was one of the first who thought about it seriously in the 50s, and who turned the direction to bring together a knowledge-based approach to architecture, using knowledge to reduce the amount of materials consumed in architecture. And through relentless experimentation, he sort of represented something which I think we need to look at today, like never before. It's the buildings continue to consume more and more material, and they are much more pompous than they used to be, and we need to reverse this trend. And I think I would like to also remember Fry Otto, and his values and his influence on my work. So when I mention knowledge-based, I want to say that when I introduce my own work, I graduated 25 years ago. My practice began 25 years ago. And at that time, our generation already knew, because we were already aware of people like Fry Otto and others who were experimenting, because they had brought to our attention that we need to look at so many things in the way architecture leaves an impact or consumes not only materials, but architects have a larger role in society, and we are visionaries. We are not just there to build pretty forms, So I was seeking, a lot of the work I'm going to show you was a result of a seeking for an alternative way of building that would have there was a seeking knowledge to find ways of building that would take into account contemporary concerns which have to do with environmental impact, social and economic sustainability, although those terms were not quite the jargon at that time. However, since the last 6 or 8 years, I see the same term and I read a different meaning in it, where building is the verb. Today, every project I do is an opportunity to build knowledge within me and collectively with everybody else who takes part in the process of architecture. And that is today my driving force. So I thought of this title, Building Knowledge, because the act of building is not just the external building. It's the act of building is creating internally, more consciousness, more awareness, more knowledge, as much as it is a result of that inner process. What manifests is a result of that kind of inner building. This is how I see my work today, and my effort since I've been more fully involved in academia since the last 8 years or so. Although I do have my practice going, and my research, I often say that I have a research-oriented practice, but a practice-oriented teaching, because I think research, practice, and academia, pure learning, I think each of these areas ought to feed the other. And in the end, whatever we are doing is to have a better world and to create, to detect real problems in society and to solve them. Or first of all, to recognize and not create problems in society for other people to solve. And secondly, to solve with whatever we are learning, and education is not restricted to the university. Learning happens throughout life, and the two worlds, I mean, the universities or schools have to be places where we can, concentrate this kind of knowledge and help society directly even before we graduate. Because we don't have time, the bad developments are happening at a pace that we can't be studying for years and years and years and then start acting. We need to act every day. So with that, I would like to begin. I want to say that a lot of in order to understand the extensive material research that I have undertaken, and I would like to establish the current concerns and my context so that you understand in which context these projects were, so that you can appreciate the relevance of them in that context, as architecture is very site-specific. I'm just going to point out through a few images the current context, which I now realize it was not only my Indian circumstances. It's relevant everywhere. So the first one is the fact that the world is turning urban from rural at a pace that no one has seen before. And this is a very complex, the fact that it's urbanizing, but the fact that it's rapidly urbanizing is something that requires new thinking and new organization. Secondly, in my immediate context, India occupies 2.4% of the world's land. It has 16% of the world's population. So regardless of what other people call green building, or regardless of standards other people set, and particularly the developed countries, we want to be a developed country, but we can't have those images, because regardless of others, we have a very small piece of cake and lots of people who want to share it, whom we need to feed. So we can't eat up our cake in one day and have nothing for the rest of the month. So we have to think in a completely different way, and it cannot come from outer standards, for this reason that we have this sort of a reality. I never felt discouraged or demoralized by this kind of huge problems that I would be aware of. I, in fact, felt very challenged that if we can solve this mess, then everybody will have to reduce their standards, because if there is a way to live with this many resources, then that would be the new standard. So I still hope I take our problems as an opportunity to redefine the standards of what we should be consuming through our habitat, and therefore I have created this chair for affordable habitat, because I think we have to redefine how we can afford to live. So for me, affordability is not only in money terms, it's also in environmental terms, in terms of all our resources, our time, everything. How much should we spend in order to organize our habitat? So the other third thing, and here is the Gurgaon picture, to sort of see the current reality and the aspirations of many Indians, or the way it is being projected through the rising GDP, etc., that we are idealizing something, which is actually a complete illusion. We're not going to be able to have this kind of an image. Neither is it good, but we are not going to be able to have this as a 21st century image. Yet this is what, because through globalization forces, and that's another point in the context I wanted to point out, is that globalization related aspirations that have come up everywhere in the world now are not sustainable. So when these kind of large companies, that are multinationals, they create offices in other places in Africa and India, the ground reality is that there is a pig, there are cows, there are little pieces of infrastructure. There's no real infrastructure. The government is not able to deliver the backdrop for this, what is, these little interventions here and there. And this is coming at an enormous price, and this sort of demand on resources to build those standard buildings that are there in Singapore, Dubai, regardless of the place, is becoming a threat actually to many countries, not just India, and basically to the whole developing world. So this is a direction which we have to oppose, and for that we need to research. So this is one of the other concerns that drove my work. One of the most worrying things for me has always been social segregation that we have in India, which I find unacceptable. That's the thing that pains me the most about India and many places, but in India it's really unacceptable. That we have, if you look at this image in Gurgaon, you have 3 skylines, and you can actually see what's happening in this particular photo, which I now really value. The middle line is the kind of construction that happens in highways in places which nobody plans. Most of the urbanization in India is unplanned. This is just happening because of the demand. People are building in places where there are no guidelines, etc. And this is the kind of development where people have had shops and then a house above it, where they just sleep, and that has expanded according to their wealth. And you see that kind of a pace of haphazard growth organically happening along highways. But when you plan something like those, what the multinationals have, through private-public, kind of initiatives that many people are, seeing as the way to go, you introduce a standard of, you bring in you promise a kind of housing standard that goes along with the kind of offices and that are elsewhere in the world. And in order to build that, you create slums. And you don't even recognize that this informal development, which ought to have been planned along with the other one, people don't even realize that that is a result of the other. I mean, the fact that all of that has to be constructed would mean that a lot of people have to migrate here and be paid, ideally, enough that for a person who's working 10 hours a day or more, that person should be able to cover his housing and education of kids and his medical whatever requirements along with food and clothes. But that's not the case. So the rich who can afford those, which is an increasing number of people who can afford, actually these people are sponsoring that. But they think that they are, going to do some charity for these. I mean, they are actually living off these people. And slums are actively the result of all the rest. And they have to be seen as an integral part of what is being unconsciously created. So this is another concern, social segregation. When I grew up in Bombay, and until I left Bombay, it wasn't so drastic. This picture, when I see, it reminds me of some other South American countries. But basically, this is where all the cities that are happening now are like this, because of the things I mentioned. So this is another very painful concern that shaped the kind of practice I have, because this kind of urban form is not acceptable. Because nobody is happy in this, neither the rich nor the middle class or the poor. Basically, everyone's struggling, and the differences that they continue to have in society manifest themselves in the urban form. And this really shows us what we are creating today. Finally, the last point, and then I will, excuse me that I won't explain all my projects. Please look for those concerns in the projects I'm going to quickly show you, because I don't want it to be a boring, long, lecture. But I would like to show you, explain these concerns, and then many of those things are published, etc. And one can probably understand visually, what I've been doing the last 25 years. This is the final concern that, along with the diverse culture that we have, especially in India, just like the food, the language, the dress, habits and customs change every couple of kilometers, we had also a rich building tradition and appropriate building technologies of vernacular architecture throughout, everywhere, came out of not only the climate of a place but also what materials were available in that place. A combination of geographical factors anchored projects to the place in which they belong, because they were built in the most efficient way with materials that came from there. Now, we've thrown the baby with the bathwater. I'm not nostalgic about old techniques. They must move. There are reasons why they are not being used, valid reasons. However, we don't have to throw the baby with the bathwater. We don't need to. If we are dull and if we are not building knowledge, if you're not thinking about things, then you think that the whole system doesn't work and you just throw the whole thing off. And over 1 or 2 generations, this will be forgotten. So, reinforced cement concrete has become the vernacular language in India, you can say, practically everywhere in the world. And every little park bench is being made with this material. So, definitely those things are over-designed. Secondly, they're not even made well, because even to make concrete, which is you need to know your chemistry, and it's not a material that you can use in a vernacular way without knowledge. So what happens is, you get all over the world, you get bad quality concrete. And once you've built a bad quality concrete, you can never fix it actually. It can never stand the monsoon. It's just going to leave a huge number of unrepairable buildings. So this is a concern. So all of these concerns I tried to design my very first project. So in fact, all of this was already there, all these concerns were already there when I graduated, and that's why I expect a lot from the younger generation, because we already knew this and we already were worrying about this. Today, this is no more an alternate area, we cannot design superficial buildings. We cannot afford to build in the way the last 20, 30 years, we can't allow ourselves this kind of frivolous, expressions, I think, because the cost is too high, not only in money terms. So what happened was that when I started my practice 25 years ago, 1990, I left Bombay and I was in a rural area called Auroville, but there was a lot of experimentation happening there, and I must say that environment, I'm also grateful to the fact that I belonged to a collective life where a lot of experimentation was taking place. And Roger Anger, among other architects about whom I eventually wrote a book, and your library has just got it today, they had already set the standard of that type of, they had those values, and I was happy to be in an environment where it was more conducive, I think, to experimentation than probably if I had continued to be in Bombay. But still, it was an active decision to go here, and I was very fortunate to have a French client who gave me this project at a very young age, so there was no looking back. And so the first project I did was, looking for an insulated roof, realizing that roofing systems are the biggest challenge in architecture, because you need to you need to know engineering, you tend to use a lot of high energy materials in the roof. So if you can solve the roof, then the rest is much easier. So in looking for an appropriate building language for that, I was planning to live there. There was an upcoming international city. So I was always thinking that every project, and now I think that always about everything we do is a prototype for everything else, or for something else. So however specifically we solve it, it's very important to reflect on whatever we do, how can that be a prototype for, how can one generalize the question so that whatever we do can be more relevant. And through that, I actually began this experimentation where I wanted to, it is not as if I'm the inventor of this. I have to say that this kind of things have been tried out by so many architects who've looked into engineering for solutions or looked into materials. And what I did is, because I noticed that there were village potters who were losing their jobs through urbanization. Nobody's going to buy, cooking pots made of terracotta, frankly, but those poor potters used to still hopefully sit in those, on those roads trying to sell their, their work and for very little money. So I thought that urbanization, if we could find a way to use the pottery to build roofs, then urbanization would not, it would rather be a guarantee for their further livelihood rather than the opposite. So I didn't know how to figure it out, and this is the message I would like to give all the students here, that you don't have to know something to be able to do it. If I would say this earlier, before being a professor, I would be chucked out, but now I can say that after having a PhD and everything, people will at least listen to me to this twice. So I'm sincerely saying this to you, that I think that the only thing that can drive you is your curiosity, and that's the only way to learn. So you don't have to build only what you know. If you don't know something, you're likely to be much more driven by that question, and then you will definitely solve it because you have a burning need to know that. So at that time I was more naive about it. I just wanted to be able to do it without knowing how risky it was and how naive it was to probably think. I thought, no, I'll solve it. If I don't work on a thing I didn't know, how would I ever solve it? So I have to start working on it. And because the question is enough to carry you to the answer. If you just do what you know, you most probably won't even have a good building. So we have to, so here basically I want to show you, you can see how I didn't know what I was doing, I was just finding out what I was just trying. I just started getting to know more about the potters, etc., and with the craftsmen and with other people. Today there are terms for this, participation and all kinds of collaborative practice. I didn't know all that. I thought that they would be able to fill in for what I didn't know, and for me to be able to get help from others in the team, I would need to work in full scale. And that's why today I'm a real believer of full scale, full scale investigation, because in order to do, if I would draw this, first of all, it's a perfect curve rather than the drawn one. And when the craftsmen, we often tend to think that we just give them direction. We are the boss and there are people under us and we just have to tell them what to do. But if I don't treat them in that way, they will be able to contribute much more intelligently to my question. Because the moment, they have the experience, they know what will stand and not. If I share what I'm looking for with others, not assuming that they don't know this, they haven't studied all this, you don't have to study, you just don't have to think of the whole engineering, just think of that one chain and which you have to build and derive the form, and those people know what you're doing and then they help because they are intelligent, they have not gone to school, but they are clever and they have experience on top of it. So with their help, I built this is my first project, and there were a whole lot of things that I researched here, climatic design, these thin ferrocement fins. I didn't know how to do any of that. I just wanted to do all that, and I learned about it in the process. And then I became more empowered by the things I learned, and I was even more daring to investigate other things that I didn't know. And that's how I kept teaching myself from project to project with the help of a lot of people. So this was that project. But in the meantime, since I was quite young, and I had to finance my life, and I didn't, I wasn't relying on support from my family, etc. So in order to take the risks I took and to be an architect and to continue a practice, I had really reduced my standard of living. I decided to build a hut because I realized a lot of people were living with a lot less, and I managed to, I also investigated, and that's why I want to remember Fry Otto again. I also investigated round wood structures where if you don't use the whole timber cross section and cut off a big fat tree and only take off the rectangular profile, you can suddenly use a much younger tree. Instead of a 25-year-old tree, you can, if you use it round, you can use a 3-year-old tree. So this is a massive amount of wood saved. So while living like this, and at that time I had my motorbike, I had that hut, that was a life I could afford, and I realized in the process that I was not disadvantaged because I became free, because I realized that to need less is a liberation, and you need less, you have more time, fantastic. So and I enjoyed it. I thought this would really last for 2 years or 3. I was also inspired by the work of John Allen, an Australian architect who had built this kind of structures in that area, and I was grateful to see that kind of experimentation. And I think I built, over the layers of other people's investigations. So I must mention him too. And so that's where I lived, and I developed my designs, and it was very simple, very, very simple. But later, that success, because I landed up living there for 10 years, by the way. And even the structure still stood, and it was given to someone else, etc. But people started asking me, ecotourism and all those things were developing, and people came with these values. They wanted to have things like that, and then we built other projects of that sort in other areas wherever it was relevant. But what I do want to mention is that around 2005, when I taught at the AA, a brief interaction with Andrew Freer. So I'm going to show you a project that brought back the research that I had done, and that's how whenever you investigate something, it's suddenly relevant to another project, extremely relevant. And at that time I was developing a series of lectures called Form Follows Technology, where I wanted to investigate that choice of material alone is not the deciding factor. I mean, there are so many things that should inform form or should inform the design of architectural design, but the technology is not just which material one chooses, because you can choose stone, and it could be either machine cut or ancient hand, carried blocks like they did in the pyramids in Egypt. So for me, technology became increasingly relevant, and all the more reason to refer to people like Fry Otto is because through negotiating the exact balance between high tech and low tech, one can arrive at an architectural strategy that is socially relevant. And because it's your choice, like if I want to build a low-cost building, it's not enough for me to spend that X amount of money. I want to know how much of that X amount of money is going to go to people and how much is going to go to material. I would prefer more to go to the people, and second question, try to give more to the people of the place out of that part of the pie. So by doing so, I realized that there are all these theories that this approach, which for me was a common sense one, actually people are suggesting this kind of approach to achieve an integrally sustainable solution that is environmentally, socially, and economically good for the place. So in this case, I want to say, now I want to mention a little bit about the way I'm teaching, I came into this project for a diploma unit where the AA had acquired some forests, called Hook Park, about in Dorset area, 30 kilometers away. And they had inherited buildings by Fry Otto and Biro Happel's collaboration for the same reason, I didn't know about this, you know. That's how you start learning, when you start doing. I didn't know when I worked with Roundwood that there was so much thought given by Fray Otto to use the thinnings of man-made forests to be able to use. You have to anyway thin them, and you can use them for building. So, and Andy Goldsworthy had made a nest-like gate out of an apparently seemingly straight, like very, very vertical kind of forest without much branches, but yet he detected the curves in that straight form, and he created this. It really, for me, was a thing to inspire those students at the AA and to realize the relationship between geometry, form, material choice, construction technology, and everything, and create a space, you know. And I also believe, I mean, so much has been talked about my research with materials. So in order to really demystify some of that, I want to say that I wasn't looking for this, I wasn't pursuing materials for their own sake. For me, architecture the usefulness of architecture lies in the void. What is useful to human beings is the part we don't build, not what we build. It's just like the old saying that the function of the pot lies in the nothingness, you know. So it's, everything is about the inside, about the immaterial. But to hold, and all the more, I experiment with material because for me, architecture is in the void, and I'm trying to create some space which is framed by some materials. But you need materials only because you want to frame that space to protect it from the climatic conditions so that the human being can spend his life and do his activities. So form, so it's, my focus is on the non-material, you know, and that's why it doesn't matter to me with what material is built. It matters in the sense that it can be any material, you know, and these materials have properties. So if you build with a brick or you build with a Tetra Pak recycled, there are similarities. So it can be whatever you have. So that, in that sense, it doesn't matter what the material is, but materials matter. But overall, the architecture is concentrated on the non-material. So for me, this is something that I want to mention. And the way I like to teach my students architecture is by letting them have some confrontations with reality also while studying. Because the education of architecture has become increasingly detached from real life, and not only architecture, basically many things. We specialize, so we focus on one thing, but we mustn't forget, while we are thinking of that, there's no contradiction. You can remain aware of life at all times in order for you to be useful in improving it. So I realized that I want my students to have the first-hand experience of architecture and integrate the various subjects they study, which can only be done in a very short way if you build in full scale. The moment you build in full scale, or you give them opportunities to build real projects, in a matter of few days, they can learn about 4 realities: true scale, true material, true people, and real place. All these 4 are not theoretical, they are real, and they inform your design instantly, automatically. You can do something in 3 days, and when you build it in real scale, you occupy that space with your own body, you know whether it makes sense or not, and you learn very quickly what not to do. And when you give up an idea, you never feel that my teacher didn't like that or so and so criticized that. You know that didn't make sense because it wasn't working. So when you work, like fashion designers and others, they work in the real material. They'll never make a woolen dress with a silk. They'll never do that. We are the only ones who will make models with any material and do some, and we forget. We have to because our projects are large, but we forget. We sometimes get misinformed. We create wrong judgments, etc. So to dispel all of that, I teach in full scale, and thinking with the hands. It's also something I quote from Fray Otto, the importance of that the hand and the model is not there just for presenting it to the client. It's there for resolving our problems. We make things to, when you keep knitting or you do something, what's happening is you're learning maths in your mind, or your brain is developing. It's not just the fact that it's handmade, or if it's machine made. It's not about artisan only. It's about an enormous learning. So for me, models are meant for resolving, or for actually designing. It's a way of using your hands as a way of developing a design. And so in that diploma project, I had taken them for 10 days just to give you an idea of the kind of things I do in workshops. And I told them, just for a change, because they're so addicted to their computers, that I gave them only toolboxes of the material I had bought for their experimentation. I bought some wood and granite, and I said, this is all we have, this is the rope we have, whatever. And I gave them little toolboxes of 1 to 50 scale pieces of whatever amounts of things we had bought. And they had to develop an environmental watchtower in the botanical garden in Oroville. So they had only one day to do the design, and they said, oh my God, we can never do, because when we work, we need weeks to do a design in class, in theory, but we don't even build it, so full scale is going to take more time. I said, it's not going to take more time. You waste a lot of time in your class because you're wandering all over the place, because you're not grounded. The moment you are with real things, you'll see what happens. So in one day, they had only one day, and everybody had known. In the beginning, they were lost, but for only half an hour or so, once they were engaged, they had their ideas. And the winning student, on the second day, there was a jury in the morning, and very practical people came, not to criticize and humiliate them like it often happens. Sorry if I'm being blunt, but that happens in juries. And instead, we had people, craftsmen and people who actually build it, who were saying, you know, this joint is not going to work. If you want to do this, if you want to make this work, you have to either give up this or that. It was all very practical. So students had this kind of advice, and they had, the next day, they presented their work to the mixed jury, people from all over life, you know, and not just architects. And then we built the winning prize. All of us, then we forget whose design it was, and we all learn further. And this is what they built, you know, and none of them had ever built anything, and I had also never done this kind of thing. So unlike many of the design-build projects, I always try to have a few craftsmen with us, because I don't like to, they have not come to become a mason, or, you know, I don't want them to be slogging, building a toilet in Africa for months. You know, don't mean to criticize that, but I try to do this one-to-one thing in a very effective way, along with people who are expert at building. So I want them to have this confrontation by working, but there are others in front of them who are very good at it. Otherwise, their own bad workmanship will again give them a wrong idea about the strength of anything. So it's got a choreography behind that. In a few days, you can learn quickly. So here are some examples of that negotiation of high tech and low tech, because you see the thatch here is held on wire, you know, the finishes are made from colored cement, you know, and sometimes the pigments are from the soil, from the place. And some of these are very old, ancient techniques that are partly revived or, you know, just revisited. And so after 10 years, I started, I did my own house, where in this case, I revived the ancient brick, which is a very weak brick, and I was trying to make the point. I had done it exposed, because I wanted to show that the good brick is probably the bad brick, and the bad brick is probably the good brick in our times, because the industrial brick, the ones Louis Kahn used in India, you know, because at that time it was like it'll be more permanent, etc. But that is a brick which our green rating systems don't, because it takes too much energy. So because it's the optimum soil, they create a huge quarry somewhere, then it's the optimum fuel, it's a lot of, you know, high strength, but that's over designed. So the local brick, which everybody does with a fertile soil that collects after rains, everywhere in Africa and India you find, those bricks are not bad, because they are not strong. You build thicker walls, it all comes together. So to promote that brick, I had actually built this house, which I'm going to quickly go through because it's in a lot of publications. I'm not going to explain. Then I continue to live here, and I worked with a lot of, you know, different layers of openings, just like we wear jackets in winter. You know, not to try to find one solution to all seasons, but have the possibility that the building can also adjust its skin in a very simple way actually. So this was my house, but the house was relevant because it was like a lab for me where I developed, like this is a filler slab system with lost terracotta used as lost shuttering, and I developed ideas in that house for much larger projects elsewhere. So it was my testing ground. Didn't want to make all the mistakes at the client's expense, and I wanted my craftsmen to be not so anxious with clients and they could make their mistakes in my own house and in order to learn it. And then I landed up doing a lot of social housing kind of projects where where these, like even the rammed earth here has been there is a little improvement. I mean, rammed earth is not from this place, but we've used it because the soil is perfect for that. And there's a percentage of cement which gives it a lot of strength, but more than anything makes it water resistant. So there's a slight, the layer of technology introduced is just enough to make it continue to be relevant. So this was a housing project for which we actually got the housing award that year. It was called Urban Eco Community, built with the people, the residents, using a range of construction systems. This is again from my house. You can see the badly made rammed earth wall. Everything was being tested in my project, and so my house is growing really slowly because I was not in a big hurry to finish it. I was still in the hut. And so these are, with using climatic comfort principles, so that's why the second floor, that instead of having stuffy corridors, these are like streets on upper levels, allowing ventilation. So I did this sort of housing projects. But one of the most radical experimentation that I did was inspired by the work of Ray Meeker, a Californian ceramist. I did my PhD later on his work, which I called Building with Fire. And what he did, he was an expert at kiln technology, and he found the idea of building kilns, houses as kilns, using the space inside to pack with ceramic material that you have to fire. Normal bricks lose about 40% of heat generated into their own walls again and again and again. So that energy could go into firing a house. So the house is made with earth and the joints are made with earth, no cement. The cement is fire. So I did a few projects with this technology as well, and we started using coal dust. I don't want to go into the technicalities, but this slide is part of his work because there's so much of ceramics used in architecture, from the toilet pan, wash basin, drain pipes, everything. So this is an orphanage I built in this technique, and we used bicycle wheels and other waste materials as formwork. And we cook this kind of, students are always in all these projects. Like I said, I investigate with students the things that I don't know. I don't like to go to school and teach what I know. What I already know, I like to do in my practice. In the school, I like to bring the questions that I don't know, investigate together. When we don't know what's going to happen, and I'm not afraid to tell them I don't know, because we'll find out together, and through this we'll know about all the other brick making and everything else when we research. So it cooks for 3 or 4 days, and then you take the bricks out, finish it, use it, sell it, recover the money of the house, whatever. And then, I did the toilet blocks with glass bottles, and sometimes materials sourced from the domestic sector are much cheaper than, there was no budget for this orphanage. It's not an orphanage, it's for homeless children. Anyway, so, there's ferrocement use. So when I was actually invited to Venice in the last Biennale, I was given actually the biggest spot, and we did the hugest project because I wanted to build one-to-one. I was taking a stand against the way architecture is represented in our times, increasingly virtual. And somehow, for me, it's not only cold, but it's also false. So I wanted to say that architecture is not only how it looks. So I wanted it to be full scale so that people can inhabit it. And because Venice had that kind of brick history exposed, only because the buildings are in ruin, you see how it was made. I decided this is the heritage structure where I was given this space to install my exhibit, and I decided to put in an architecture of the wall house, the one I just showed you, build it in full scale and infuse it with this to show that architecture is a continuity. It doesn't have to confront an old space. We are building gentle layers because the theme was common ground, and I wanted to say we already have much more in common than different. Our differences are so small, which just matters is the perspective. The roof was a terracotta roof using a lot of wood. So if I would put in my bricks and my thing in this space, you would show how technology evolved gradually and how learnings from one culture moved to another, etc. And how we are part of a much larger thing. And I had the opportunity to document and demonstrate the value in the old so-called bad bricks for our times, and to show with what they are fired and how thatch is used and what kind of brickwork. Also, since I hadn't documented many of my projects, often it was cheaper to build one more house than pay a photographer. But that's not the only excuse. I should take some part of the blame. So I landed up not having, I used to not have very good documentation, but since we were motivated by the Biennale, we had the opportunity to reenact the whole thing that we did in those days and document everything well and show that to make one building, to make one house, see how many hands are involved. Look at this whole culture, because I use lime from the place, there's a whole settlement whom I would have displaced if I had only prescribed Portland cement. You know, I realized later even much more value in it. So I brought all of this to Australia where I was teaching. We tested everything that we hadn't done before when I didn't have engineers, when they didn't want to work with me, you know, the good ones. So then I managed to do all of this properly and make it even more efficient and to study, you know, what was actually done 20 years ago. So this was completely built by students in 6 weeks. There were this was a learning experience, 20 students from Australia, 10 students from Venice, Indian craftsmen who were then the unskilled labor who are now expert heritage craftsmen. They were working together without a common language. Each and every material was true from the place, you know, stones, and it's, you know, it's to work in the common ground exhibit, but to bring in ideas of David Leatherbarrow, who talked about the uncommon ground, about architecture being site specific. So I wanted to also represent the opposite of common ground. These are the workers. You see the current Venetian bricks are totally different from the ancient one. And you'll see how our building, my building, which is a contemporary building placed in South India, nothing to do with Venice, seemed more belonging to the Venetian landscape. And that's what I wanted to show. We are like magicians, you know, architects. We create things. You can make things appear, disappear. If you are skillful, you can create harmony with what is there. You know, whether there are trees on the site or columns in the space, you can make everything fit. So here's the team. Here are the discussions, not many. Very easy to understand each other when you're working on full-scale things. Everyone's practical and collaborative. And we built and learned everything that was there to be done. It was an educational experience. And that's why I think education should create opportunities to, when you have to build real projects, you can already enter that and learn much more. But we had things like this where I did some things differently, like the glass bottle roof. I mean, we used bottles, we cut them and used the recycled Venetian wine bottles, and finally achieved this kind of dialogue between the old and the new, which was one of continuity and not of confrontation. So you see the architecture in ruin along with the architecture under construction. There's no need for any posters. There's no need for any other explanation because everybody could understand it at their own level. The engineers could see the engineering, the artisans could see the craftsmanship, etc. But by feeling the ground, feeling the common ground. So it was called Feel the Ground, this exhibit. And I had brought the table in to complete that's the only piece I really brought. And we built everything, including the garden. So I'm just going to mention another, just show it because there's no time. But this is the latest project which won us the NDTV Best Commercial Project of the Year this year. Just last month we got it. It's made looking at the life of stone cutters of South India, and that they have the skill to hand level grinding stones, and they have done this. It was an exhibition on contemporary handmade products, and I wanted to make the statement that luxury is about having the time to make, and so this is that project, an undulating landscape, and I'm just going to go very quickly through this one. This is a project in Barcelona where I built the Library of Lost Books. The project was called Unbound, and the theme was liberty. I wanted to expose the problem of what's happening to the afterlife of books and how they are being pulped and burnt, etc., everywhere. And the books are, the physical object of the book is undergoing a major social transformation. And while we were rethinking the future library, where you don't just exchange books with digital ways today. My students explored full scale also how to build with books, because we took books out of the cellar of the old catalogs, etc., and we made sofas and we demonstrated the strength. So I told them that just think that we are in a utopian country where this is the only material, and just take what you have around you, but build anything with that. And in this case, the exhibition that our installation had to do in Barcelona, I took the open book and I packed it like they packed their precious ham to extend its life. I thought, let's extend the life of books, and we built canopies. They cut a lot of trees to make those books, which they're not using. So let's build the trees back, and we don't need books because people are only reading on their iPhones and all that. So let the act of reading go on. The books are up there as a memory, and it was a public space intervention which was very successful because we had hardly used any money for that. My current focus of research is actually ferrocement, which because it uses significantly less material than others, and where form and geometry contribute to structural efficiency, not the choice of material. It's the form you design that has more strength or less. So at the moment I'm looking at origami and crease patterns that will lend ferrocement more strength to be enable that larger spans can be made. And since ferrocement is less than 2 centimeters thick, it's an inch, it can be made on paper formwork, hopefully, recycled cartons, and you can wrap up all of this, carry it to a disaster relief place or whatever, and quickly put up with such little steel, with only steel mesh primarily, this sort of structures. This is an ongoing research, and in my search for, through this workshop, the last thing I achieved was this kind of a Lego system with container boxes made of ferrocement. My students investigating in the backyard of masons, so that masons can work overtime, produce little units, not in the factory, but increase their income. We'll collect all this from their houses, and they've been painting their houses very brightly to feel happy in their troubled life. So now I wanted to also introduce the color back into these modules, and we built this very, very cheap house. We just did it last month, and these are containers which have all your things can be fit in, so you don't need any furniture on top of it, and you don't have a cluttered house. So your 3 meters that you have is really free space with kitchens, bathrooms, everything, modules for everything. And that was first tested on children, because children have 1 to 2 scale. So if I don't want to do 1 to 1, I first go 1 to 2 with children. And children are also very free. They do, they know what they're doing. They don't feel, they're fearless. So I work with them. And this, I'll end with this 2 images of, I just came from Mexico 3 days ago. I was conducting a workshop with them. I was given 3 days to do something with the students. So it's called the liquid wall. In a public space, we built something out of milk cartons. We recycled them, and we filled them with, I wanted to fill them with liquid. We partly filled them with sand, partly empty. We are still finding out, but I wanted to basically build with water. Don't think it's a Tetra Pak that you're using, but think of it as something wonderfully designed to contain fluid, and then fluid can give strength to the building. It has thermal properties and so on. And the Tetra Pak is already done to carry liquid, but it's not. It's a fantastic thing. It shouldn't be wasted. And it's a big problem on our society now, the disposal of Tetra Pak. So we did this thing, and here you see that immediately people started using it. We hadn't even finished, but the artists and the dancers and people from the place who need a backdrop started using this. So yeah, this is Liquid Wall, the last project from yesterday. I want to end with not the beautiful picture, but with the ugly one, because we are really producing ugliness at a rate at which it doesn't match up to the beauty we are producing. We are producing a lot, bags and bags of ugliness every day. So let's first spend that while we try to reduce more than building. Let's try to create less ugliness first. Reduce that and then try to notice that it's ugly, and with that ugly thing you can actually make a beautiful thing. Okay, I hope it was not a bit too long, and probably it was, but excuse me. Thank you. Yes, actually, we tried two things. Finally, we used kind of the hot glue because the students, because we actually think that if it's filled with water, it'll be less flat, I mean less necessary. But because it had sand and they weren't able to fill it to the top, it was a little bumpy. And because we were doing our first test and the workmanship was not good enough, we thought we have to add that in the public space. But I would like to continue investigating and not using
This
glue.
isn't a hot glue kind of nasty to work with?
Yes, it is. It is, but not the nastiest thing. I mean,
Why?
because I'll say why. Because I in my experimentation, whenever I run into the not finding the ideal solution, I think I try to focus on one aspect of it, which in this case was how to use the block. So I try to just solve that, and then I'm going to be doing this for now many years. Then I'm going to, in the next one, I'll focus on the glue, and I also need to focus on I wanted thicker walls, so it would not be needed, the glue, but we didn't have that many things in Mexico where I have no control. So, I'll be taking one question at a time. So in that sense, I mean, it's not the worst problem. I mean, first you build one thing and then keep improving it. Yeah.
Hi, how do you get prior approval for all of these like international projects if you're not working, if you're working one-to-one? Like, do you have like small or like 2D one-to-one projects?
I actually think I have not found too many difficulties with approvals. We expected a lot of difficulties here in Mexico. It was in the main street. But somehow, when you do humble things, I don't know why people want it to happen too. And I know that there's no formula for that. But I've noticed that if you connect with other people, and if you're not a solitary person who just wants to do it for yourself, usually when you start talking to people, like we didn't expect to know the Tetra Pak boss of the Tetra Pak recycling who gave us some useful tips. Now we are connected to the ones in Spain, and we start knowing people and they have their contacts, and I don't know, somehow it comes together. And also, whenever they told me, like in the Biennale, it was the hardest to get the permission for a full house because it was a heritage structure and people were reducing their posters, and even smaller installations were being redesigned because they had given us very conservative loads on the ground. But I've noticed whatever obstacle I am faced with, whether it's permissions or this permission was for heritage protection. Usually what I do is I try to not get overwhelmed by the no. I'm not at all discouraged, and that's what happens. Most people just accept the no. I never accept it because I think, who made all those laws, We made them. So there must be a way, and that everything, this is all made up of human beings. So you need to talk and negotiate and explain that whichever law it doesn't apply to you. And if it does, then I will change. I mean, if there's a good reason behind the constraint, then I won't impose my wish. So it's I mean, for instance, in the case of the Biennale, what I did is they said a full-scale structure. All the Italians said, no chance, this is a heritage building. You can't. I said, I agree. Just tell me how many kilograms per square meter I'm allowed to put. So they didn't know what is heavy or not. They had not defined that clearly. They just got afraid. So they had to do their homework and tell me how many kilos per square meter. And then I send them a design which was that many kilograms per square meter. And they had to say fine. So it's easy. And then I know more about the structure as a result.
One more question. Come on. Hi, I was wondering how you see all the solutions you have for using such diverse materials translate into like the urbanization problems that we face.
You were wondering what other materials I.
Well, how you see like, because you use very diverse materials, how do you see those translate into urbanization and into large scale projects?
I think that all large-scale projects are made with small materials. I mean, you know, materials have just certain fixed kind of properties. They're either good for in compression, or they're good in tension, or they have their properties. And I think every place you go to has different natural materials with which, like if I'm doing a steel thing, I could also do it with bamboo. If I'm doing some block thing, compression, it could be mud. It could be hundreds of local materials. So I'm not so focused on finding new materials as I am with new technologies to use the same old materials. So my attention is in finding to use significantly less of the material. On the other hand, what I do now is I don't look at only traditional material. I try to absorb the junk that we are creating in the buildings. And in doing so, my material palette has suddenly expanded. And I see, everywhere I go, I see, I look at like a vulture, I say, I can use that, I can use that. And there are hundreds of things we produce which we don't need. But if you go down to the properties of that material, and if you just supplement your knowledge with your imagination, you suddenly have lots more materials than the catalogs give you. And I relate it to urbanization because I think urbanization is creating material, rather not only spending material, they are creating material which we don't consider material. We call it garbage, but it's actually material.
Okay, with that, I'm going to give you a small gift, so please come back to the
thank
podium
you.
for a moment. You mentioned your uncle's connection to the BAC, and this is a book which is a personal history from Don Brown, who helped the Casheri lectureship keep going.
Thank you so much.
And it's his 40 years and the entire history of the college, so I hope you'll keep reading.
Thanks
and
a lot.
with us, and then
Thanks
do
so
some more
much.
things. So thanks so much. For
Thank you
being our
very much.
20th.
So I hope it was in line with your
Very much.
Your
Yes,
concerns
exceeded
and-
expectations. So please, there'll be about 5 minutes to come to see Anupama at the lectern, and then we're going to go downstairs in the reception and toast her there.
Thank you all.